I really appreciate this Sunday where we're honoring these high school graduates. As this little service was taking place, it took me back to January in my last year of high school, grade 12, Britannia High School. That January is when I took a Gideon Bible off of my shelf and opened it up and began to read it and study it. That took place, as I said last night, after my studies in astronomy and physics had convinced me that there had to be a God behind the universe. And I went on a quest to find that God. I was looking in all the wrong places. I thought I would find it in the writings of the great philosophers, read the Hindu Vedas, the Quran, the Buddhist commentaries. But then I remembered that Gideon Bible was given to me 6 years previously. Pulled it off my shelf, dusted it off, and began to open it up. And that was the beginning of my journey of discovering that the Bible is the inspired, inerrant Word of God. It's a book that actually predicts future scientific discoveries and did it with such precision that it left me with no doubt. This indeed is a message from the Creator of the universe to all of humanity. Now, we're actually giving away a different book today than we gave during the conference. So if you go to our book table there, they will give you our book, Testing Testable Faith. And if you're participating virtually, we're making available to you an ebook on the answering the 10 most difficult questions from the Old Testament. So scan that QR code, and that's your cue to get a free book. And hey, if you don't have a smartphone, talk nicely. They'll probably find some way to give it to you anyway. So, science and the Bible. So I've been getting that a lot during my time here is, what are the best scientific evidences for the Christian faith? Well, I actually developed a whole week-long conference series on this topic, and I go through what I refer to as the Big Five, the 5 most significant and potent scientific evidences for the inerrancy of the Bible and the Christian faith. As you see here, it's the origin of the universe. If the universe has a beginning, and we study that beginning, does it testify of the kind of creation that God claims in the Bible? Number 2 is the fine-tuning, the design of the universe, earth, and life, so that billions of human beings can be redeemed in a relatively short period of time. Number 3, looking at the Genesis creation events. It was looking at Genesis chapter. I remember that first night in January of my high school grade 12 year, looking at the first page of the Bible and realizing everything is in the correct order. Everything is correctly stated. The only way this can be so precise, including the order, is if Moses had been inspired by the one that actually did the deeds. Years later, I discovered a lot of people lost their faith looking at Genesis 1. So I'm going to share with you tonight how to share with people, how to, talk to people who think that the Bible teaches scientific nonsense because what they think Genesis 1 is teaching. The origin of life, and then the origin of human beings and the exceptional nature of human beings. Now, as I mentioned, this is a full week's worth of talks. I'm not going to try to cram that all into 30 minutes. I know that that would be just kind of a blitz for all of you. So I'm going to pick and choose and just give you a couple of points. But I am going to start with the origin of the universe. I was reading the Bible at the same time that physicists in South Africa and Britain were developing the first of the space-time theorems. We now have over 30 of these space-time theorems. But the one that's gotten the most attention is the one produced by Arvind Borde, Alexander Vilenkin, and Alan Guth. And this is what their theorem states. Any universe that expands on average throughout its history has a space-time beginning, implying a causal agent outside of space and time who creates our universe of space, time, matter, and energy. Now, Borde and Vilenkin had already published 5 papers where they say, we can think of a universe in which there is no such causal agent, but it's a universe that does not expand on average. And when they recognize only a universe that expands on average throughout its history permits the existence of life, even microbial life requires that we live in a continuously expanding universe. And what caught my attention when I was 17 years of age, looking at the Quran, the Hindu Vedas, the Buddhist commentaries, looking at Zoroastrianism, Mormonism, etc., I discovered that in those religions, they have a different concept of how the universe came to existence. Many of those religions speak about the beginning of matter and energy, but the Bible stood alone in saying it's not just the beginning of matter and energy, it's the beginning of space and time itself. And what particularly impressed me are those passages in the Bible that state that God began his works of redemption before he created anything at all. 2 Timothy 1:9, the grace of God that we now experience was put into effect before the beginning of time. Titus 1:2, the hope we share in Jesus Christ was again given to us before the beginning of time. This implies that everything that God creates is for the purpose of bringing billions of his human beings into a loving relationship with him. And so the God of the Bible creates independent of space and time, not within space and time. Now, none of these three authors of the space-time theorem are believers. But Alexander Vilenkin, a year and a half later, published a book in which he stated the following. He said, quote, with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And he really didn't address that problem, but this is the problem. Proof of a space-time beginning implies that a causal agent beyond space and time creates our universe of space, time, matter, and energy. So just within the first few minutes this evening, we've established beyond any reasonable shadow of doubt, a transcendent God must exist. And the latest books being put out by atheist physicists and astronomers, they still call themselves atheists, but what they're saying is, we cannot take deism off the scientific table. The space-time theorems compel a deistic interpretation of reality. So the remaining question is God personal? Did he design the universe and the earth for the redemption of billions of human beings? So this is the debate issue. And I debate a lot of atheist scientists, and this is where the debate has changed. Yes, there's a God, but they're denying that God is personal. I'm claiming that God is personal. Now, number two was the design argument. And that traditionally has been the go-to strong argument of Christians to establish the existence of the God of the Bible ever since the early church fathers. And for that reason, I've written 7 full-length books on the design argument for the God of the Bible. And I'm not going to bore you with taking you through the content of all 7 of those books, but I'm going to give you a brief summary. Because what you see in Psalms and Job is that the more we learn about the natural realm, the more we learn about nature, the more evidence we'll uncover for the supernatural handiwork of God. And so back in 1991, we took our small scientific team and said, let's actually go through the scientific literature. And let's actually collate these characteristics of the universe and the laws of physics, where the degree of fine-tuning design is orders and orders of magnitude greater than what we human beings can manifest. You may have heard of dark energy. It's the dominant component of the universe, makes up 70% of the universe. What you might not realize, in order for life to exist in the universe, that dark energy parameter has to be fine-tuned to within 1 part in 10 to the 122nd power. Now, as we compare that with the very best example of human engineering design and inventiveness, it exceeds it by a factor of 10 to the 97 times, which means that the one that created the universe at a minimum is 10 trillion times more intelligent and more knowledgeable than all those Caltech and MIT physicists who invented this amazing machine that displays that high degree of a fine-tuned design. And so back in 1991, we found 17 features of the universe that displayed that level of design. And as we continue to read the scientific literature, by 1995, It came up to 26. Now it's above 200. I don't have time to take you through the documentation, but you can get that. Reasons.org/fine-tuning. If you put that into any search engine, it will pop up for you. A 300-page compendium where we list all these amazing discoveries, and we actually give all the journal articles where these are established. You can read them for yourselves. Reasons.org/fine-tuning. But this is what Paul Davies. Paul Davies is a British theoretical physicist. I've actually debated him 3 times. I really can't call it a debate. It's more of a dialogue. In fact, the last time I had a dialogue with him on public radio, he made the comment, "You guys at Reasons to Believe have a testable creation model. If you've got a testable creation model that's testable, falsifiable, and predictive, you deserve a seat at the scientific table. I welcome you." In fact, he said, "Next time I'm in the Los Angeles area, can I come by and actually have some time with you and your fellow scientists?" Paul Davies. But he wrote a book called The Cosmic Blueprint. And the second to last page of his book, he made this statement: when you look at the universe, the impression of design is overwhelming. And this whole book is filled with all this evidence for the design of the universe. But I've gotten some pushback from my peers who are not believers. They say, yes, we see all this amazing design in the universe, but we only know of one universe. You can't make a statistical argument based on a sample size of one. And this is something else I've noticed. In my library, again, I've got several dozen books, in fact, I think it's 70 books now, on what we call the anthropic principle. And we look at the universe, we see this pervasive, overwhelming evidence for design. But the ones that are written by people who are not followers of Jesus Christ, they stop at the universe. And so what I've done in these 7 books that I've written is basically say, we see this overwhelming design on all size scales. And the thing about the universe, it still gives some comfort for the non-theists because they can hold this God at an arm's length. The universe is big. But what I've documented in my books, we see not just as overwhelming evidence for design at the level of the universe, we see it at the level of the super galaxy cluster in which we reside. We're inside a galaxy cluster that's composed of thousands of galaxy clusters and galaxy groups. But ours has a design that we don't see in any other super galaxy cluster. We live in the only one that permits the existence of advanced life. Then you zoom in and look at our galaxy cluster, or our galaxy group, we notice we live in the only galaxy cluster that has the fine-tuned design characteristics that permits our existence. We live in the only galaxy group, and we live in the only galaxy. Do you know that there's over 200 fine-tuned features of our Milky Way galaxy that makes it possible for you to be in this building tonight? 200 different features. And we're discovering more with every month that goes by. And this is something I showed last night, is our Milky Way galaxy, lower right. The other 5 galaxies are the 5 spiral galaxies that come the closest to looking like our spiral galaxy. But I think just in this one slide, you can see how different our Milky Way galaxy is. The spiral arms are highly symmetrical. You've got that barred core in the middle that's just right to permit the existence of advanced life and to ensure we don't have too big of a supermassive black hole. Very few spurs and feathers between the spiral arms. A just right galaxy. But we're also orbiting a just right star. And if you were here last night, I actually showed you the luminosity stability of our sun compared to the luminosity stability of the second most stable star we've been able to observe in our Milky Way galaxy. Our sun is 5 times more stable than the star that places second to the sun. And only a star with that extreme degree of luminosity stability would permit the existence of advanced life here on planet Earth with a capability to launch and sustain civilization. Last night, too, I mentioned we have now found 5,380 planets. And I remember when the first ones were being discovered in 1995, my peers were saying, we're going to find hundreds of planets, just like the planets in our solar system. Well, here we are, 2023, and as we look at that list, we see that none of them are like Earth, none of them are like Venus, none of them are like any of the 8 planets in our solar system. And this led to the discovery that we need all 8 planets in our solar system to be exactly the way they are for advanced life to be possible here on planet Earth. So I was sharing with some of you this afternoon, when October comes around and you're celebrating Thanksgiving, don't just thank God for planet Earth. You need to be thanking God for Neptune, Uranus, Jupiter, Saturn, Venus, Mercury, because there'd be no Thanksgiving dinner if those planets weren't fine-tuned to the degree that they are. And this is even true of our asteroid and comet belts. We have 5 asteroid and comet belts. We're now finding these belts around other stars. But here's what we're finding. 80% of them have no comets or asteroids at all. The other 20% have asteroid and comet belts 1,000 times bigger than ours or even bigger. And what we need for advanced life is 5 small asteroid and comet belts of just the right population, just the right distance from the star. That's exactly what we got in our solar system. So yes, when Thanksgiving comes around, you might want to thank God for the Kuiper Belt. I want to thank God for the Centaurs, the Oort cloud, etc. And of course, you want to thank God for planet Earth. Over 500 different features of our Earth have been fine-tuned to make our existence possible. Take away any one of them, we would not have a meeting here tonight. There'd be no humans on the face of the Earth. And some of the latest discoveries are focusing on our moon. Over 20 features of our moon have been fine-tuned to make possible our existence here on planet Earth. So yes, thank God for the moon. And this is what Freeman Dyson, a famous American astrophysicist, had to say about the fine-tuning of our galaxy and our planetary system. He says, the more I examine the universe, the more evidence I find that the universe in some sense must have known we were coming. Now, we astronomers are completely ignorant of the present. All of our data comes from the past because it takes light time to travel from the stars and planets and galaxies to our telescope. I share this with my wife all the time who's sitting here. I'm an astronomer. You can't hold me accountable for the present. All my data comes from the past. That doesn't get me very far. But what Freeman Dyson is pointing out is that every event in the history of the universe, from 13.79 billion years ago right up to the present, every single event plays a role in making possible the existence of us human beings. Indeed, the universe was prepared in advance for the entry of us human beings. Okay, a couple of places you can go. You can get the 4th edition of The Creator and the Cosmos. I think they got some of the table there. And we're giving away chapter 15, which focuses on the fine-tuning evidence, for free at reasons.org/Ross. And my latest book on fine-tuning, Designed to the Core. Again, you can get a free chapter at reasons.org/Ross. But I want to spend the rest of the time getting on the first page of the Bible, because I've discovered as I travel around the world, page 1 of the Bible, for many people, is the biggest stumbling block preventing them from giving their lives over to Jesus Christ. So how can we get people past this? Well, what I've discovered is, for me, Genesis 1 was step 1 in my becoming a follower of Jesus Christ. But I've run into a lot of scientists, engineers, other people. I've run into some of you this morning, this afternoon as I was speaking, is that they fail to understand the point of view for the text. Now, I don't know what it's like in Canadian elementary schools and high schools today, but for me, back in the dark ages, they taught us the scientific method in grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. We got it every single year. It was hammered into us, this scientific method. So when I picked up the Bible at age 17, I immediately spotted the scientific method in Genesis chapter 1. Step one of the scientific method: do not interpret until you first establish the frame of reference or the point of view. Step two, don't interpret until you establish the starting conditions or the initial conditions. And for Genesis 1:1, it's the universe. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Incidentally, there is no biblical Hebrew word for universe, but you'll find this phrase, the heavens and the earth, 13 times in the Old Testament, always referring to the totality of physical reality. That's the Hebrew phrase for the universe. So in the beginning, God created the universe. That was the point of view for Genesis 1:1. But as soon as you get to Genesis 1:2, it changes the frame of reference to the surface of the earth. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters of planet Earth. So if you remember nothing else from my message tonight, please remember this. We're to understand the 6 days of creation, not from the point of view of God above the earth, looking down on the earth, but from the point of view of God on the surface of the waters, looking up at the clouds. So below the clouds, on the surface of the waters. That makes all the difference. If you have the point of view above the earth, then indeed I agree with my skeptical scientist friends. Genesis 1 is teaching nothing but scientific nonsense. But if you put the point of view on the surface of the waters, the chronology is all accurate and the description of the events is accurate to a degree that we realize this is not just coming from the mind of Moses. Moses had to be inspired by the one that actually did the deed. And Genesis 1:2 also gives us the 4 starting conditions. It says it's dark on the surface of the waters. The waters cover the whole surface of the earth, and the earth is formless and void. In what context? The 6 days are talking about God creating life. So I believe Genesis 1:2 is telling us, initially, the earth was unfit for life and empty of life. And it was dark on the surface of the waters. Waters covered the whole surface. But now God begins to work. Now, when you look at the other holy books of the religions of the world, you might find one text that deals with the story of creation, maybe 2 texts. The Bible has over 24 texts. And 3 of those texts parallel Genesis chapter 1. And this is something I did as a 17-year-old. I said, I'm going to read all these books in the best possible interpretive light. When I read the Quran and put it in the best possible interpretive light, it was clear that it was filled with contradictions and errors. I also put the Bible to the best possible interpretive light. I also made a commitment. I'm not going to settle on an interpretation until I read the whole book. And when I did that, I discovered that Genesis 1 is not the biblical text that gives us the most details on the science of creation. That is Job 37, 38, and 39. So you get way more scientific details in the book of Job than you get in Genesis chapter 1. But Psalm 104 that I mentioned last night also takes you the content of the 6 days, as does Proverb 8. Now, none of those 3 texts put it in a chronological order, but they give you a lot more detail about what's being described in Genesis chapter 1. And this is what Job 38:9 says. I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness. So Job explicitly tells us why it's dark on the surface of the waters. The early earth had a cloud layer that blocked out light. Now, because I was a student of astronomy, I immediately understood that because I knew that the early earth began with an atmosphere 200 times thicker than it has today. Venus right now is an atmosphere 90 times thicker than the earth. That atmosphere on Venus is so thick that no visible light gets through to the surface except at this extreme red end of the spectrum. Earth's atmosphere being 3 times thicker, there would have been no visible light coming through to the surface of the earth at all. It would have been dark, just like it says in Genesis 1:2. And God says, I made the clouds its garment, and wrapped it in thick darkness. Then we move into creation day 1. And what does it say? Let there be light. Now, carefully notice, it doesn't say that God created light on day 1. It doesn't say that God made light. He says, let the light be. When did God create the light? In the beginning, when he created the universe of matter, energy, space, and time. Energy means that there was light pervading the universe, but it was dark on the surface of the waters because the earth's clouds prevented that light from coming through. But on creation day one, the atmosphere is thinned out. We now know how that happened. There were two planets that collided, and this resulted in the early Earth losing its atmosphere and getting a much thinner atmosphere in its place. But this is when photosynthesis is now possible. Earth's atmosphere no longer is dark. Light is able to come through, and that light facilitates photosynthetic life on planet Earth. And what's interesting, Genesis 1:2 speaks about the Spirit of God hovering over the surface of the waters. The Hebrew word there shows up only one other time in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, where it speaks about a female eagle hovering over her eggs as they're about to hatch. So a lot of Bible scholars think the origin of life is an event that happened at the beginning of creation day one, when photosynthesis could take place. The creation day that has developed the most controversy, particularly in the last couple of years, a lot of theologians have been making claims about creation day 2 because it's so brief. It just says there's water above and water below. There's really no explanation. But no explanation is necessary because we have an entire chapter and a half on creation day 2 in the book of Job. And in Job 37, the first half of Job 38, it not only speaks about a bountiful water cycle, it tells us explicitly that it includes 3 distinct forms of liquid precipitation and 3 distinct forms of frozen precipitation. And in my book on weathering climate change, I actually explain why we need all 6 in order to produce the food that we need to feed billions of human beings here on planet Earth and all of our animals. But Job said it first. Also, we need to realize Job is the oldest book in the Bible. It's a book written when there were no priests. It was the patriarchs that were doing the sacrifices. And so Moses didn't have to repeat what Job had already declared in the book of Job. Okay, moving into creation day 3, it talks about there being, let me pull this back here. Here we go. All right. Let there be these land masses. This is when God transforms planet Earth from a water world to where we have oceans and continents coexisting with one another. Now, I read this, back in the 50s, and back in the 50s, what the textbooks were saying was that the continents have always been here. And I was picking up the Bible in the early 1960s, and now I was at the University of British Columbia, and there were 3 physicists that launched the discipline of plate tectonics. All 3 of them are Canadians. And 2 of those Canadians were professors at the University of British Columbia, and they said, let's actually teach the very first course ever presented on plate tectonics. I was a sophomore physics student at that time. It was graduate students who were taking the class. They let me in. I managed to find a way to get in. And I remember the professors there saying that because of plate tectonics, the coverage of the surface with continents grows over time. And I remember them showing this graph in that class. And I went up to one of the professors afterwards and said, I noticed you have it starting at about 7% of the surface of the Earth. Could it be 0? He said, it could be anywhere between 0 and 10%. So I said, gee, maybe the Bible's got it right. Fast forward to the year 2000, and basically what you see is that we have an aggressive period of continental landmass buildup when the Earth is a little bit less than 1/3 of its present age. Where does Genesis 1 put it? The beginning of creation day 3. But here's the very latest. We now know that the growth of continental landmasses is very much linked to the deep oxygen cycle. And so we have what we call the great oxygenation event, and this is when the continents go from less than 1% of the coverage of Earth's surface up to 27%. I show you this to make the point. The more we learn about the physics of the earth, the tighter and tighter fit we get with what Genesis 1 declares about the history of the earth. If you want to read about this, it's in my books, but you can read it for free. Every week I put out an article called Today's New Reason to Believe. So the June 11th, 2018 article talks about this discovery of how we have this very sudden growth of the continental land masses. Moving into creation day 4, let there be lights in the sky. That's 1:14, and notice here again, it doesn't say that God created the lights, it doesn't say that God made the lights. Those are made in the beginning. This is the first time they appear. And if you read the rest of verse 14, it says, let there be the great lights so that they may serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years. I remember reading that at age 17. I said, well, for whose benefit? Well, creation day 5 is when God creates the first animals on planet Earth. And animals are the one kind of life that cannot survive unless they have access to the position of the sun, moon, and stars in the sky. The plants don't need it, the algae don't need it, the microbes don't need it, but animals are so complex that they have these circadian clocks, and what regulates their biological clocks is the position of the sun, moon, and stars in the sky. We now understand what was responsible for transforming the atmosphere of the earth from a thick haze that would let light through, but forbid the visibility of the objects responsible for the light. It's oxygen. And this was an experiment done in 2018 where a group of physicists said, we know the oxygenation history of the first 4 billion years of the earth. Less than 1% except for a tiny blip when it's about 2.5 billion years old, and we get a sudden jump of oxygen about 580 million years ago. And so they created an experiment where they basically had a huge flask and they filled it with the known components of Earth's atmosphere, and then they began with less than 1% oxygen and began to push the oxygen content up. And I've done a simulation here of their experiment, and what I have is a camera located less than 1/3 of a mile, less than half a kilometer away from a big mountain in Colorado, Engineer Peak. Okay, what you see here is 1% oxygen. You can't see the peak. Okay, you go up to 2% oxygen, you begin to see something in the background. You can't quite make it out. 4%, hey, there's something there. Then you get up to 6%, you can clearly see there's a mountain there, and then we push it up to 8%, and guess what appears in the sky? You can now see the moon. The moon is only visible when it's at 8%. And so this explains the miracle of creation day 4. The oxygen content suddenly rose. We know why it rose. It was another big event in the deep oxygen cycle. So it went from less than 1% up to 8%. Creation day 5. Basically, oh, by the way, you can read an article on this if you want. But creation day 5 is when we first see the animals. But this we see in the fossil record. Nothing but microbes until 580 million years ago. Then suddenly you got animals as big as 2 meters across in body size. Animals cannot possibly exist with less than 8% oxygen. But the very moment the oxygen jumps from less than 1% to 8%, you immediately have animals. That's the Avalon explosion of life, quickly followed by the Cambrian explosion, where the oxygen jumps suddenly from 8% to 10%. Now you can have animals with a circulatory system, a digestive tract, with eyes and ears, with a brain. And what we see is all the phyla of these advanced animals showing up simultaneously. Matter of fact, the phylum that we human beings are part of were there at the very beginning of the Cambrian explosion. And what James Valentine had to say, he's one of the world's experts on the Cambrian explosion, and of course I think you're all aware, the best exposure of Cambrian explosion fossils is right here in British Columbia, in a gorgeous place, in the Canadian Rockies. And they just discovered a brand new one in Marble Canyon. Wonderful place to go and visit. But what James Valentine said, from a naturalistic perspective, we would expect that you get the proliferation of species through natural selection, gene exchange, mutations, and eventually that will lead to new genera, which will eventually give us new families, new orders, new classes, and last of all, new phyla. But he says, we look at the Avalon and Cameron explosions, we see the exact opposite. The differentiation of phyla occurs first, then classes, then orders, last of all, the species. And he and many paleontologists now acknowledge that this basically is the death knell of naturalistic evolution. There's no way naturalistic processes would predict that, but a creator would. Here's the bottom line. With the word day, yom, equal to an epoch of time, and the frame of reference being Earth's surface, the accuracy we get with the events of creation are 10 for 10 in terms of their description, and 10 for 10 in terms of the chronological order in which they appear. The best I had found outside of the Bible was the Enuma Elish of the Babylonian creation myth. It got 2 out of 14 right. The Bible alone gets a perfect score, not only on the description of the events, but the order in which they're placed. And that was a huge factor in my signing my name at the back of a Gideon Bible, committing my life to Jesus Christ. But if you want more details on it, of course, I got a book on this, Navigating Genesis. But again, I want to remind you, the more we learn about science, the more reasons we gain to believe in Jesus Christ as Creator, Lord, and Savior. Well, thank you. It's been wonderful being with you this time. I look forward to tomorrow. And be sure to get your free book. Thank you.